Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Welcome to the Not Old Better Show Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. I'm Paul Vogelzang, and today we have a truly remarkable episode lined up for you. Get ready to embark on a journey through 9 centuries of history, reimagined through the eyes of the women who lived it, shaped it, and often redefined it. Our guest today is none other than the best-selling author, Smithsonian Associate Philippa Gregory. Smithsonian Associate Philippa Gregory will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up, so please check out our show notes today for more information. But we have Philippa Gregory today here with us. Philippa Gregory's works, like The Other Boleyn Girl and The White Queen, have captivated readers worldwide. But today, Philippa Gregory brings us something entirely different with profound impact. Her latest book, Normal Women, is a groundbreaking exploration of the lives of women in England from 1066 to the present day. Imagine women who rode in jousts, flew Spitfires during World War II, issued their own currency, and built ships and corn mills. Picture female soldiers, highway women, pirates, miners, and even theater impresarios. These are not the stories of queens and noblewomen we often hear, but of the ordinary yet extraordinary women who have been the true backbone of English society. In today's episode, Philippa Gregory will share with us how she unearthed these incredible stories from the annals of history, revealing a tapestry of lives that are as diverse and varied as the women themselves. With Smithsonian Associate Philippa Gregory, we will delve into the challenges these women faced, the prejudices they overcame, and the indelible marks they left on history. Philippa Gregory, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be with you.
It's so nice to talk to you. I am a longtime fan, as are so many, especially in our audience. Congratulations on this wonderful book, Normal Women. We're going to be talking about it today. We're going to be talking about your upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation. And why don't we just start right there? You'll be presenting at Smithsonian Associates coming up, but give us a little brief about what you're going to be telling our audience, and in particular, how you're going to be using Zoom, because there are some amazing photos and images in this book. I want to make sure and touch on those today.
I hope very much we'll be able to include them in the conversation. What's so interesting for me about this book is that it's absolutely new material out of a record that we all know very, very well. So we start with the invasion of William of Normandy in 1066, and everybody thinks they know everything about that. But the question really is, what happens to the women, and where are the women in the record? And it's wonderful to look at something that is very familiar, that we all think we know, and then go like, actually, you can read it in a quite different way. And I hear your giggle, and I know what you're laughing
at. Yes. Certainly, we shouldn't forget the women. And I'll mention this too, right at the very outset of the book, you have this wonderful black and white picture of your own mother. My hat's off to you on all of this hard work, but especially I think to cite a wonderful inspiration. My own mother is an inspiration for me. What inspired you to write the book and to make sure and maintain a record of all of these amazing activities of women?
Well, what we've seen in the writing of history generally is that the big historians, especially historians of the Tudors, were the Victorians. And they did really the major work in looking at the medieval records, reading them in Old French, reading them in Latin, reading them in Greek, with the extraordinary scholarship that these all-male historians brought to the work. And what they gave to us, subsequent generations, was a fantastic translation, but also an edited version. So what they don't do is they don't translate or work on anything that they think isn't of much interest. And subsequent generations have gone like, actually, we are quite interested in that. So if you read the Victorian history of, for instance, the discovery of Africa, you get lots and lots of accounts of white men going into Africa, discovering Africa. Your own country has obviously a massive contribution in that as well with the explorer Stanley. What you don't get is anything at all about indigenous Black culture, which is what we're now interested in. So what you have to do is you have to go back to these wonderfully researched, wonderfully written records and say, I see what you're telling me about, but actually I want to know about what's going on in the background. I want to know about the things which are not foreground for you. So we've seen a real recovery of history, particularly in histories of the global majority of different ethnicities, particularly in England of the histories of the working class, which was almost completely neglected until the middle of the 20th century. When I came to study history in the 1980s, we were just starting to look at the history of women. And so when I came to write my novels, what was becoming apparent was that we were getting a sort of a top 10 list of interesting women. So when you talked about women's history, everybody always talked about Victoria I, Elizabeth I, probably Mary, Queen of Scots, maybe Eleanor of Aquitaine, maybe Joan of Arc, maybe Emily Pankhurst, but that was pretty well it. And it became very clear to me that when you were talking about women's history, you were always going back to these names. You were never widening the research. There just wasn't a history of normal women, of women leading normal lives, ordinary lives, everyday lives, although their doings and even their names sometimes are recorded in the archives. So in a moment of complete madness, about 12 years ago, I set myself to write a history of everyday women, normal women, in all of the richness and variety and extraordinary occurrences and day-to-day boredom of their lives, everything. I wanted to have a history which would stand beside the national history, because when we read the national history of England, it's almost always a history of men. And what I wanted was to write a national history of England, which was almost only women. And if I had known how long it would have taken me and how much work it enormously was, I swear to you, I would never have started. But because it was a long time ago and because I was embarking in hope, because when I started, I went, oh, this is going to be pretty good, because there weren't many records of Anglo-Saxon women and there weren't many records of women in the Domesday Book. And I went, I'm going to get through this chapter pretty quick. And indeed I did. So what there is fascinating, but it's not widely reported. So my first chapter was an absolute triumph of recovery of normal women's history. And then, of course, I waded into the years where there is tons of records about women, and it became much more of a sifting and a filtering and a research process than I would ever have dreamed possible. And as I say, it took me from start to finish probably about 12 years.
Well, again, congratulations. The research is amazing. And these normal women really kept the pages turning for me. And I wonder if you'll just talk for a moment about some of the surprising, lesser known stories of some of these normal women that you uncovered in your research. Maybe tell us one or two.
Well, the great temptation is always to look at the individual women. And of course, that just gets you back into the loop of here's an extraordinary woman doing something extraordinary. So the women that I really, really love are the ones who are stand out, fascinating, but they are typical of the women of their time. And where we make the mistake, I think, in focusing on Joan of Arc and Elizabeth I is they are standout women, but they're not typical of the women of the time. Whereas Agnes Hotot, who was alive in about the 1300s, she was at a joust. Her father was about to joust to defend his claim for some land. He'd had a quarrel with another landowner. He was a Norman lord. And he'd had a quarrel with a Norman landowner, and they decided to settle the quarrel as to who owned the land by having a joust off. I mean, they were just going to fight each other in the lists, each one on a horse, hammering towards each other with a lance and their armor. And whoever got knocked off the horse would not get the land. And her father was just about to do this when he was taken ill. He was in danger, therefore, of losing his entire claim to the land because he couldn't get on his horse. And she put on armor and helmet and got on the horse and took up her lance and stood at the end of the tilting corridor, as it were, hammered down, whacked the opponent, a full-size, great big man, fully armed, fully knighted up on his great big horse, knocked him off his horse, which just itself takes such power and strength and courage. And then when he was on the ground, got off her own horse, went to the middle of the tilting ring, stood over him to indicate that she had beaten him, took her helmet off, shook out her hair like a James Bond girl, and undid her breastplate and showed her breasts. So that there was no doubt in anybody's mind that he had been, as we would say in England, well and truly spanked, and that by a woman. What's fascinating about that is that nobody said, my God, she went naked, that's shameful. In fact, she then married into the Dudley family, and they were so proud of her that they produced a crest for her in her family, in the Dudley family tree, of her bare-breasted. So there was no shame to her connected with that. And there was no question in those days about ladylike behavior, about women being fragile and frail and frightened. What you see, what I love about her is that is typical, actually, of medieval women, where they are much more overt about their bodies. They're much more happy to be seen as a fighting quality, of able to take center stage and able to take up weapons. And all of that you lose round about the 18th century. But the reason that I love Agnes is that it's an extraordinary story to us. Yeah. But it's not untypical of medieval women. So what you get there is not just a real heroine, but a normal woman. That heroism was normal for medieval women.
Hi, it's Paul. Do you love entertaining, informative, eclectic, insightful programs about culture, health, science, life, and everything Smithsonian? As part of our Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast, we're introducing you to the new Smithsonian Associates streaming series. Smithsonian, a non-profit organization, is excited to present this new aspect of their 55 years as the world's largest museum-based educational program. Join us from the comfort of your home as we periodically interview Smithsonian Associate guest speakers. Our audience here on radio and podcast can explore our website for more information, links, and details at notold-better.com. Thanks, everybody.
The title of the book, of course, is Normal Women, 900 Years of Making History. Philippa Gregory, Smithsonian Associates, our guest today. Again, congratulations, Philippa Gregory, on this amazing book and these amazing stories. I wonder if you'll tell us just a little bit about how some of the roles of women, their contribution changed over centuries, particularly when it comes to wars or plagues or contentions, certain events that took place. Did women's roles grow? Did they start to have a bit more say in things that were going on during those times?
I think what's really very interesting is as soon as there is a time of civic disruption or danger or difficulty, and that will be in the medieval period, particularly plagues or the sweating sickness or wars, or later on civil wars or any sort of unrest, you immediately find the society needs everybody to chip in and work. And it's at that moment the women get all of these opportunities and are actually invited into the trade guilds to work as tradesmen, so blacksmiths or farriers or makers of armor, or prominent in the textile trades, or really, really developing food production and brewing production, because the country is in emergency and it has to have all the talent and all the skill and all the workforce it can lay its hands on. And in those moments, you see women not just entering all of these trades, but getting to the very top of them, because they bring to, as they always do, all this talent and ability, which is in peacetime and in good times not wanted. So what you see, for instance, at the time of the plague in England, 1348, is women taking up every single occupation, going into tenancies, running big farms, going into businesses, running big businesses. You have women architects. You have women taking over their dead father's businesses or taking over their dead husband's businesses, or just setting up independently, because the country needs these people so much that it doesn't really care what sex they are. It really has no interest in what sex they are. What it has to have is people working and producing to get the country back on its feet again. And then all of these women turn out, do this fantastic work. And then what you see, and you see it over and over again, is that as the country goes into more prosperity and into more success, the men who are still the only men in Parliament, women never get into Parliament until they get the vote, which is very, very much later in the 20th century. the men in Parliament and the men who make the laws, and it's still mostly men inheriting and kings, they go like, hang on a minute, there is enormous profit to be made from these businesses. There is enormous profit to be made from the land. We're not scrabbling around to survive anymore. What we're looking at is fantastic opportunities, and we don't want women doing it. We want to keep it for us and for our sons and for our designated heirs. And you see the guilds and what were then like the employers' associations squeezing women out, passing laws so that women get paid less, even when they're doing exactly the same job as men, passing laws so they can't join into unions, passing laws so that they can't be freemen of the city and trade in the city. And what you see is women just being squeezed out of these trades, these profitable trades and these opportunities, and returning to domestic work, farming still, feeding their families, raising their children, supporting their husbands, and working for low wages for the support of the family. What you don't see them is running the big businesses anymore. They get squeezed out every single time until the cycle turns around, there's another emergency, and women come back into the workplace again. And I imagine you even see it in the history of America when you have pioneer women, like everybody needs everybody to work really effectively. So you have an equality in emergency or times of warfare when you have women going into the factories and going into heavy industry, and you have this desperate need for a fully skilled up, fully employed workforce. And then after the emergency, you start pushing women back into the home.
It seemed too in the book that after the emergency, women's roles became, I'm thinking about the food riots, and I'm thinking about some of the environmental causes that you cite, the reclaiming of royal forests, and how that's led perhaps today to more of a role for women in some of these very important causes of the moment. And I think about Greta Thunberg and her work on behalf of the environment. There was a real shift towards this, and women played a very big role in some of these events. I would think that some of the history that you found and researched is now, in fact, influencing some of these women today.
Oh, I'm sure there is a real sense that because the drive to push women back into nurturing family and domestic roles, and what you always see is this sort of pushback and then this push forward. Women under the cloak of that, we are nurturing, managed to push forward into like, we're not just nurturing our children, but we think we have responsibility for all children. And you see that in the rise of female philanthropy in the 19th century, where women start to, in a sense, glorify their role as homemakers and say they're responsible for everybody's home, even poor people. And that, in a sense, gives them a permitted authority in the society. So they are allowed to work as philanthropists, and they are admitted to work for government agencies as sort of supporters of women's domestic lives. That's considered respectable. Whereas actually, if they wanted to, for instance, report on factories or mines, it wouldn't be respectable. You couldn't have a woman doing that. So what you see, I think, is always happens with women is when you cut down their opportunities and you say you can do this, they then do that superbly and immediately try and expand it. And in a way, you know, your very kind tribute to the photograph of my mother at the start of the book of Normal Women. She was a woman who was literally only allowed out of her accepted role as a sort of upper middle class girl pre-war. Because the Second World War came, she got into uniform. She was allowed away from home. She socialized without her mother's supervision. She didn't have to be the younger daughter at home anymore. She literally lived elsewhere. She lived in barracks. She had this extraordinary 6 years of freedom, which, of course, coincided with, in many ways, the worst years of her life, which was her country was at war and she was in danger and everybody she knew and loved was in danger. But for her, the domestic prison literally just opened. And then after the war, she never went back in the same way, although she certainly got married and didn't work post-war. She and my father went overseas to Africa and actually set up a home in what was then a colonial area and subsequently became an independent country of Kenya. So there are times when the doors open for women and they never shut again as tight as they did before. And that's what you see in women, in a sense, when they defend their homes, they are licensed to expand their world.
Again, Philippa Gregory, Smithsonian Associate, is our guest today, author of the wonderful book, Normal Women. It's fantastic. And many are saying this about the book. Philippa Gregory, Dan Jones has said that Philippa Gregory has produced something rare and wonderful, a genuinely new history of our nation with women at its beating heart. I really love that comment and that mention by Dan Jones. The other thing that struck me too is, as we were talking about some of the traditional roles that women have held over the years, is that women also flew Spitfire airplanes. Tell us about that story, because that's a great context in and amongst all the rest of the work that women are doing.
Well, yes. And of course, it's very typical of the fact that in peacetime, pre-World War II, there are civilian planes, and it's possible, if you're very wealthy and very privileged, that your family might choose to buy a plane. And in which case, if you're very privileged and very wealthy, your family might let you learn how to fly, or your father might teach you how to fly if you're a woman, or your brother might let you come up with him and teach you how to fly. And then when World War II breaks out, not only does every man who might want to fly or might be persuaded to fly desperately needed in the RAF, which doesn't have enough planes or enough pilots or enough crew or even enough ground crew to face the challenge that the Luftwaffe in order to defend Britain from the Blitz. But what they discover very fast is that as quickly as they are building planes, they cannot get them delivered to the airfields where they have to be for the pilots to fly them. So although you don't ever have women flying on the front line, as far as we know, though I imagine that a couple sneaked in, but we don't have any record of them yet. What you do have is you have the ATC, the women were allowed to join the Army Transport Corps, and they are delivering not just Spitfires, but enormous bombers and transport planes and really anything that anybody wants from the factories to another airfield, or from where they land to the airfield where they're supposed to be dispatched from. So it's a huge logistical problem. And the only people who can do it are the women, because you really want your highly trained, highly capable male pilots flying missions. You don't want them running planes around the country. You want them fit and fresh to fly the missions, which is so essential. So you end up with this extraordinary core of quite extraordinary women who by and large volunteer. Some of them have flown pre-war. Some of them have never even been behind the wheel of a car. And they give them this extraordinary fast crash training program of how to fly a plane. They never teach them how to navigate from instruments, because that's regarded as it would take too long. And anyway, they're required to fly any plane. So with men, if a man's going to be a Spitfire pilot, he's taught how to fly a Spitfire. If he's going to be a bomber pilot, he's taught how to fly a bomber. With the women, they simply didn't have enough time. And I think they didn't care enough for these less trained, less specialist women, because they could get more of them. Whereas a Spitfire pilot, a fully trained Spitfire pilot, is a very precious commodity. And you're going to burn through them really fast because their work is so dangerous. So with the women, they don't teach them to fly from instruments because they don't have time to teach them the different instruments of each different plane. They don't even teach them how to fly each plane. They develop a book. So in the morning, a woman would go into her airfield for her shift, and they would say, today you're flying a Lancaster. Have you ever flown one before? She'd say, no, I trained on something else. And they would go, okay, well, here's the book. She'd take the book. She'd get behind the wheel, the rudder, whatever it is of this plane. She would look up in the book. This is how to fly the plane. I mean, who does that? This is just extraordinary. And she would go, oh, okay, that'll probably be all right. And she would taxi the plane, take off. The first time she'd ever taken off in that plane would be the time she had to take off. And then she would fly it to the airport where she was told to fly it to by having a map on her knee, looking down at the ground, seeing where she had to go, and looking out for the various sites that she'd been told to look out for. So extraordinarily, there was quite a high accident rate, of course. There was quite a high death rate. Nothing like the men who were flying missions, but very high, considering that these were women who were trained in a matter of weeks and then put into any sort of plane on any sort of day. She would fly to the airfield where she had to deliver her plane, hop out, then she'd probably get into a transport plane to fly back. She might be flying it back, or she might be given another plane to fly somewhere else. They would literally be all over the country. And of course, flying without instruments is completely weather dependent. And so some of them would, bearing in mind the urgency of the need to get the planes to where they were wanted, they would fly late when it was getting dark. They would fly early when it was misty. They would fly in storms, or storms might blow up while they were flying. And one of them earned the nickname of Fog Flyer because she used to be able to find her way to the airport where she was supposed to be in the thickest fog, just running on instinct and courage and sheer nerve. Obviously, everyone in England today owes a terrific debt to the men who served so courageously in our RAF and in our other services during World War II. My father was on bombers, so I am particularly aware of the danger that they faced. But they knew that they owed a tremendous debt to these women who had been civilians just weeks before they got into a plane.
Will do. And what a pleasure it's been to talk to you. I just have one final question for you, Philippa Gregory, about normal women. What is it that modern society can learn from history, especially about these normal women?
I think the biggest takeaway for me has been, after working on these documents and learning about these women, is the fact that every society teaches its girls what is the nature of a woman. We don't do it to boys in the same way at all, but to girls in particular, we really say to them, women are like this. They are like this naturally. All women are like this. Women have always been like this. Women always will be like this. And that is what you, a young woman, have to grow into and have to be. And I think when you look at what people said medieval women had to be, they said to them, you have to be mostly the breadwinner. Your family will depend upon you for you to do most of the food production, food growing, sale. You will be bringing in the majority of the bread, literally. And then when women were deprived of the fields and the lands, the pressure still remained. It is your job to feed and raise and get the family, and you will accept any work and any wages to do that. Then you start to have women being persuaded that their work is intrinsically less valuable than men's work, and that it is absolutely right, just and normal that they should get less than men get. And that continues to this day. So in England today, women's average pay is about 3/4 of the male average pay. And without teaching our girls that that is the norm, we just bring them up with that sort of expectation. We just naturally do, unless we make the effort to say to them, this is actually against the law that women should be paid less. Similarly, we have this kind of belief that men are more prone to violence and certainly more driven by sexual urges to such a point that they may not be able to control themselves, and that women have to defend themselves and protect themselves and guard themselves against violent assault or sexual assault, like it's women's problem. And of course, we teach our girls that because we want to keep them safe in a society which is very violent against them. But at the same time, when you say that, you are in a sense sanctioning this idea that male sexual drive is to men irresistible, and to women you may have to resist within fear of your life. So what we do when we have these ideas about women's behavior, when we teach them to women, we're really sanctioning the behavior for the next generation. And what's been really, really clear to me is how artificial these roles and behaviors are, that every generation has its own taboos, has its own permissions, and has its own idea of what is normal women behavior. And the whole point of the book is to say this entire range of behavior, from women's extreme aggressiveness to women's extreme vulnerability, all of this is normal. That is possible for all women. And you as a woman should be able to take your choice where you sit on the spectrum.
Wonderful, wonderful reporting, amazing research, Philippa Gregory. And I can't recommend the book enough to our audience, of course, of Smithsonian Associates. The title is Normal Women, 900 Years of Making History by Philippa Gregory. Smithsonian Associate will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up Please check out the links in our notes today for more information about Philippa Gregory, her new book, all of her books. And Philippa Gregory, congratulations again on this wonderful book and giving us a sense of how important these normal women are and the issues that they face that we all need to be more aware of. But thank you for your time. Thanks for being so generous. Please come back again, too, to see us.
It's been a real pleasure. I'll certainly come back. Ask me again. I'd love to. Thank you.
I will do it. Thank you very much.
My thanks to author Philippa Gregory. Philippa Gregory, of course, will be presenting at Smithsonian Associates coming up, so please check out our show notes for more details. My thanks, as always, to the Smithsonian team for their work in helping us with the show. My thanks to Sam Henniger for helping with the show, too, as executive producer. Sam's a sound designer, and he does an awful lot of great work. My thanks, of course, to you, our wonderful audience here on radio and podcast. Please be well, be safe, and let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you next week.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. To find out more about all of today's stories or to view our extensive back catalog of previous shows, simply visit notold-better.com. Join us again next time as we deep dive into some of the most fascinating real-life stories from across the world, all focused on this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show.
Hi, one final thing. Please check out our website for this episode and all episodes at notold-better.com or subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to check out your local radio stations to find out more about the Not Old Better Show on podcast and radio. You can find us all over social media. Our Twitter feed is Not Old Better, and we're on Instagram at Not Old Better too. The Not Old Better Show is a production of NOBS Studios. I'm Paul Vogelzang, and I hope you'll join me again next time to talk about better. The Not Old Better Show. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.